Welcome to HIV The Morning After. I'm Dan Hall. I'm a documentary producer and director. I've spent my entire adult life watching ignorance and prejudice play out around HIV. And frankly, I'm tired of it. And I'm sure many of you are too. This podcast is an attempt to do something about that. Not through lectures or statistics, but by doing what I do best. Interviewing people and letting them tell their own stories. Real voices, lived experiences, no bullshit. These conversations matter, and if you think so too, please rate, review, and share HIV The Morning After. I can make these episodes, but I can't make people listen to them or find them on their algorithms. That bit's down to you. You can reach me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. Right then, let's get started. My guest today is Nikolaj Tange Lange. In 2007, he wrote a punk song with the chorus, "Gay is the new punk, 'cause we don't give a fuck about dying while we're young." Months later, he tested positive for HIV. Nikolaj is a Danish writer and musician living in Berlin. He's published 5 novels, he's performed in porn films proudly under his real name, and he's spent nearly 2 decades navigating the gap between what the world thinks HIV means and what it actually means to live with it. Nikolaj, welcome to HIV The Morning After.
Thank you.
So let's start with Berlin, autumn 2007. There's a party. Tell me about that night.
Well, it was during the Berlin Porn Film Festival, the second year. Just a small venue. I'd been partying like all week because they had after parties every night. And I was also performing there during that week. But then, I think it was Friday night, I meet this guy that I instantly am attracted to. He's like kind of punky with a mohawk and short trimmed mohawk. We go home to his place and open a couple of beers and then leave them on the coffee table and head straight to his bedroom and get our clothes off. And I've been probably drinking and taking speed and smoking cigarettes all night. But so we're both kind of drunk, slightly high, more kind of morning after post high kind of state. And what then happens is that I remember that he just sticks his dick inside me without a condom, which was something I generally didn't do at the time. And I tell him, stop. But I also hesitate a little. I'm a little slow. I'm also in it. But I'm like, no, wait. I don't do this.
So this is in a period that is pre-PrEP. I mean, I find it incredible how quickly we have gotten used to the normalization of barebacking now since PrEP has become available. But this is pre-PrEP. And can you give me an idea a bit of what the sex world, of what the pre-PrEP sex world was like in Berlin in 2007?
I mean, you mentioned the song "Gays and New Punk, We Don't Give a Fuck About Dying While We're Young." That was very much inspired by my experience of coming to Berlin and realizing that everyone was just having sex without condoms all over when you went out. Condoms were already in the scene, in the dark rooms, in the leather bars, in the sex clubs, was already more the exception. They were there and people were using them, but it was rather a choice to use them, and it was the exception, and it was something you had to say so, and it would usually be accepted. But
I often wonder when I hear people talk about Berlin, one of the reasons people find Berlin threatening or dangerous is because it lets you be who you want to be. And that can sometimes be the most dangerous thing of all.
Yeah. I mean, I do remember having, like, before I went to Berlin myself, I heard people who had been, like, friends who traveled here, and they told about this, how they'd gone to, like, Connection. Like, there was the big Schöneberg gay club back then, and told about how everyone all over were fucking about condoms. And to me back then, there was, like the early 2000s, that was, like, I didn't believe it. It was, like, sounded like such a, like, how can this be? Like, people choosing something that at the time I thought was like, well, are they just choosing death? Like, what? I didn't understand. And also, like, but what then happened in between was, like, you know, I saw, like, several friends who were living with HIV at the time who was like, well, they're living, like, perfectly normal, healthy lives.
You were on one hand looking at people fucking around without condoms thinking, are these people crazy? Yeah. And yet at the same time, you were also looking at friends who you knew were living with HIV, who seemed to be living absolutely fine. And this just really conflicting in your mind with what you perceived, which is people get HIV, they get ill and die. And it didn't sort of fit with that.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a discrepancy between, like, the narrative that had, like, been internalized in me, and then what I experienced and saw that slowly had to, like, come to terms with each other. I guess also, like, I mean, I grew up in Denmark where we had, like, extremely efficient HIV awareness campaigns throughout the 80s and 90s. Like, there was, like, you know, when I came home from school and turned on, like, afternoon youth programs on TV, there would be, like, HIV awareness ads in between the programs. So we were extremely well informed, and this thing of, like, use a condom or you will get a virus that will kill you. The idea of not using a condom was not even, like, an option.
And I remember, so I was born in 1973, and I very much sexually came of age in the middle of the HIV pandemic, and also very much associated sex with condoms, and there was no other sex available to me. Like, it was just not, it was unthinkable, just like you said.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, sex with condoms is fine, sex with condoms is great, until the first time I was fucked bareback. And I vividly remember being so blown away by the sense of intimacy that I almost wanted to cry.
I didn't actually have that. There was not, like, the sensation. I think that difference only came later when it became part of, like, you know, a scene where the irresponsibility or whatever, or the transgressiveness, or the, you know, that you can just have sex however you want and without precautions and without worrying about safety, that became, like, I think that became it more than, like, the difference in physicality.
I think you're hugely right. I think there is something inherently exciting about transgression.
Yeah.
When you're a queer person living in a heteronormative society, when your mere existence is considered transgressive, whether anybody has asked you to be transgressive or not, to do something that is in itself transgressive is incredibly exciting.
There's definitely been this part of, like, for a long time, sex had been just, like also associated with something that you, like, apart from, like, it being not, like, for years not so interesting to me, it had also been associated with, like, fear and need for responsibility and care and so on. That once I got to that point where I was no longer afraid, and at the same time tested positive, and here again, I'm not sure if I tested positive because I stopped being afraid, or if I stopped being afraid because I tested positive, because it just kind of happened at the same time.
That's very interesting, and that's fascinating, isn't it? That the two are almost blurred in your mind.
Yeah.
So taking us back to where we were talking at the start of this conversation, in Berlin, autumn, you've been at this party, you've gone home with a Mohawk guy, you've fucked bareback. What happens next?
Okay, what comes next after that night is that a week or two later, I'm home, and in the afternoon I suddenly start coughing. and it gets worse and worse. And I just feel like a pain in the back and my chest at the same time, which makes the coughing even worse because my chest really hurts and I keep coughing, and one just kind of like feeds the other. And my flatmate is like, should we maybe take you to the emergency room? And I'm like, no, it's fine. And it just gets worse and worse. And into the evening, suddenly I'm like, I can barely move anymore. And I just cough like crazy. And I'm like, yes, please now call that taxi. We need to go.
So this is your seroconversion, I guess. And
yes,
it's
exactly.
Really hitting you.
Like in the week or two after, I'm not really particularly thinking of it. Like that we talked about a condom. It's not the first time I've done it. I don't generally do it, but it's also something that I'm not greatly afraid of it anymore. It's more like the first times I did it, I had been like terrified. Now I'm not really so much anymore. So I don't really think about it. But when I go to the hospital, of course, they ask if I know my HIV status, and I say I don't, and they ask if it's okay to do a test, and they do that test, and the next morning they come back and say that it's positive. And also what they also did, apart from that, was they did an Western blot analysis that further, without me knowing the medical technicalities of how it works, confirms that the conversion, like my infection, was recent, which is why I can confirm for sure that guy I met at the porn film festival party is indeed the one I was infected by.
The Mohawk guy.
The Mohawk guy, yeah.
So you were in that hospital bed for 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah.
And at what point did someone explain to you what living with HIV might actually mean for your future?
I mean, I guess I had an idea. I think as far as I remember in the hospital, I was 27 at the time, was like, well, I'll probably at least gonna turn like 60 or something, which when you're 27 is like the same as like, yeah, whatever. I think I still at that time had an idea that I would maybe die a little sooner, but I would be old enough that it wouldn't like make a significant difference. But then what also happened at the time was I was part of like what caused the pneumonia, apart from the drop in my immune system, was that I had been smoking like 50 filterless cigarettes a day for the weeks around then. And after being in the hospital for 2 weeks with pneumonia, and I had half a year afterwards where like my lungs were still not properly back to normal, and my doctor was not sure they would ever fully recover. So I also quit smoking after that, and I have not missed a cigarette or even thought for a second that there could be anything appealing about having a cigarette for just a second since then. And I then asked my doctor, like, well, I mean, at least having HIV today is probably not much more dangerous than like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And he was then saying like that, no, probably quite to the contrary, that smoking a pack of cigarettes a day is probably significantly worse than being HIV positive for your health.
And you mentioned in your research notes while you were in hospital that you saw someone who you described as the ghost patient.
It was at a time when they still took me to a special ward that was for patients with HIV that doesn't exist anymore. And somehow I'm kind of like, in a strange way, like grateful for having been to that place, because it's, I don't know how medically necessary it was, or like what difference it did that it was there, but somehow it felt like a church for me in a way to go there. And I'm not religious, but this place of like, going to this place that held all this history of, like, this used to be the main ward. This used to be where HIV patients that were terminal went in Berlin. And there was something like really beautiful about being given that connection to that history, even though I knew also that I was myself going to be in a very, very different place, and was very privileged compared to all these people that I was not gonna get sick like them, but there was, I remember there was this like younger guy there who was maybe like my age, who just looked very, very sick. And of course I had no idea like what kind of like cross infections he could have had and what other problems he potentially could have had. But it just gave me this kind of like kind of awe of now carrying this that I also somehow saw as like, a piece of like queer gay history.
It's curious that you're in this space and you know the history of this ward and you see this very ill person in front of you. And instead of doing what I think many people would do, and that is turn it in on yourself and simply be fearful of your own future and what that means, you instead have a response of seeing it as an incredibly important space of queer remembrance and a trauma that has happened to what I would consider to be our family.
Yeah. I also remember that it's strange that I kind of thought he was hot in a way.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with being horny in hospital. I tell you what, around my local sexual health clinic in Dean Street in London, when you go downstairs and there's usually about 30 guys waiting to go in, we're all on Grindr and we're all cruising each other.
Yeah.
I've never understood why people are embarrassed about going to sexual health clinics. It might be simply because from when I was first sexually active, the world I was growing up in, my inspiring queer leaders with me at university created a culture within me to go and get sexual health checkups every 3 months, which I have done since 1992. Yeah. Frankly, I think it's great. If I'm getting enough sex, that I should be going to a sexual health clinic every 3 months. Good on me. And if people see me going in and out of there, I hope they give me a round of applause for getting laid plenty.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't understand why there's stigma about it. It's crazy.
I also think that has changed a lot. Like, that was like my memory of my first HIV test. That was like 25 years ago. I recently, and it was in Copenhagen, in Copenhagen also went to get tested again for other things there, but they also did HIV tests, and there was like, they had like R&B music playing, and there were like people saying like, hi, welcome, there's a bit of waiting time, but there's free coffee and condoms, so make yourself at home. And people were sitting like chatting, and others were being on Grindr, and I don't know, but it was just a very different feel.
So you've written a Substack piece about Mohawk guy, who you're pretty sure was the chap from whom you contracted HIV.
Actually, I put it on Substack, but it's actually like a chapter from my novel Romeo and Seahorse.
And you said in that piece that you continued to meet him several times after that. Can you talk us through that? Because I think it's, like I said, we generally avoid conversations on this podcast about who did it and who didn't and blah, blah. But it feels like there's an interesting relationship here to explore, because none of my guests have spoken about this before. Can you help explain to us why you continue to go to see him? I'm guessing initially because he was hot.
Because he was hot, yeah, and I was horny. And having gone from being like not a super sexual person, partially because I was like very much a romantic, but also like held back by like sex was like something that you had to be very like sensible about. Suddenly you didn't need to be sensible about sex anymore. Like I had also just moved to Berlin. I had just discovered like Berghain, like the first club I went to that had a dog room. To not have to have all this like concern and worry and things was like a new world that opened itself for me. I guess there's often this like idea that like, HIV is to blame for like chemsex pandemic because it made all of us like depressed and sad, and therefore we're using drugs to escape. And that I would say is not my experience. I mean, I have this like sentence that I say my definition of addiction is addiction is when desire no longer leads to pleasure, but only to more desire. And that I feel is often describing very much like a chemsex addiction. It's like you keep pursuing something and you never actually really get like the satisfaction you come in it for. You just like take more drugs to become more horny, so you can take more drugs to become more horny.
as more and more people in your life became aware of your status, as you shared it with more people, how did you manage it when people asked you, oh, how did you get it? Do you know? It's like, and with hindsight, you think none of your fucking business. And I would share that information with you if I wanted you to know. So how did you deal with that?
I usually didn't tell them that I knew who it was, because I could predict their reaction, that they would be like, oh my God, like, have you talked to him or confronted him, or and they would be outraged, and I don't want people to be like, I hate that thing where people get like more emotionally outraged by something that is about me, and then I have to like, so I would just say I don't know, because it didn't matter to me. And I would definitely not tell them that I had sex with that guy again several times since.
And why do you feel it's a very positive thing to not seek blame?
I mean, it's just a thing that happened, and if it hadn't happened with him, I'm sure it would have happened with somebody else at another time. It didn't happen. I don't think it happened because of something he did. It happened because I had stopped being afraid, or I stopped being afraid because it happened. It definitely like created a new connection to my body and my sexuality that I hadn't had before. That gave me a lot. There was this thing, we have this like dating app here in Berlin called Gay Romeo. Now I think it's just called Romeo, where in the search criteria, you can search for somebody's safer sex principles or whatever. And for a long time, the criteria was like safer sex, always, never, or needs discussion. I don't like the phrasing needs discussion. It sounds like you're going to get an argument about it, but basically meant like as we agree upon, like we will just need to like agree upon this. And what needs discussion and practicality always meant everyone knew was that it's somebody who is positive and would prefer, or definitely at least be like open to having bareback sex. And that was kind of like the official coming out in the scene at the time. It's like when you updated your status on Gay Romeo to safer sex needs discussion, which I was very fast to do at the time. And suddenly it meant that like the people who contacted me were different people.
Yeah, I remember on Grindr in the sort of 2010s when people put on at the beginning of their profile name bareback. It was a code. It was a code that you understood.
Yeah. But like the thing about like Gay Romeo here was like, it was not just like something you wrote in your headline. It was like a filter. It was like a search criteria. So you also could like update your search criteria so that you would basically only see people who had like safer sex needs discussion. And when you went to maybe, I don't know, we didn't call them chills at the time. We just called them, I don't know, like a group session or whatever. You often knew that like the people who organized this or invited, they had this filter on when inviting. So you knew that tonight is going to be a group of people who all have safer sex needs discussion.
Which was a code for people living with HIV.
HIV positive. Yeah. What that then also created was like, it created then this like, bubble in a way of people where it was the norm at a time when there was still a stigma around. I mean, that in a way, I was going to say it created a safe space. Often those spaces were anything but safe, because it was also like where that kind of like radical form of intimacy there is in a space where you have something like this in common.
Especially when it's a sharing about something for which outside the doors of that room, those people will be stigmatized.
But there was a time when that stigma of HIV that was like not an issue in these like cis male sex spaces, then still was like something that if I was dating a person that was like not part of the scene, suddenly this fear would come back with the like potential of disclosure and how do I handle this?
Because of course you're not sharing your status once, are you? You're sharing it every time you are meeting someone new, or you are starting a new job, or you are going to a new clinic. It's something the same about coming out as being gay. People sort of think we do these things once. And actually, we have to do them every time we go into a space, because if you live in a heteronormative world, the assumption is usually that you will be heterosexual when you enter a room. If you live in a world where most people are not living with HIV, it'll be assumed that you're not living with HIV. And so this coming out process never ends, and it's exhausting.
And it's also this like thing of like, how do you manage this? Like going into like, if you're dating somebody where you're like, this person maybe don't know a lot because they like, it could be like, a younger person. It could be a tourist. It could be like if you're dating like somebody who's like maybe like trans, non-binary and not part of like regularly part of the same gay scene that you are part of, then suddenly you can't depend on them having the same knowledge or level of information. And you have to like wonder, like, for instance, like if I know that I am undetectable and therefore there's no risk of HIV transmission, is it enough that I like know this? And therefore cannot be and therefore like my status is irrelevant to the other person. If I also know that the person would be highly uncomfortable if I told them, like suddenly like having to deal with these kind of dilemmas that now with PrEP are like not so much anymore. But there was definitely like a good 10 years where like dealing with these dilemmas definitely like made me gravitate more to these like cis male sex, often like transgression seeking spaces, and maybe like stay within those more than I would have liked to.
But I have never felt that it is someone else's role to share their status with me.
No.
I believe strongly that my body is my responsibility. It's not someone else's responsibility. Genuinely, I think that your attitude and your thoughts towards Mohawk Man are fantastic, and I absolutely understand them, because ultimately it is your body. Unless it involves a sexual assault, it is actually your body, and you are choosing what you want to do with it. And it amazes me and annoys me how many people do not take responsibility for their own bodies, and instead they say, well, it's that guy's fault because he did not share his status with me. No, it's your fault because of the sex that you chose to have.
I principally agree, but I also agree because these are like, the norms in the scene that I am part of. So for instance, if I meet a person from like, in Sweden, it's like, it's the law that even if you have safer sex, you are obliged to reveal your status. And that's where like then I get in a conflict or feel a dilemma when I'm like, I principally myself totally agree with you. And it's also the norms of the circles I'm usually in, and therefore I can be like comfortable and rely on that people will have the same norms. But if I know that somebody else will experience something as a potential assault if I do something to them, then I can't just be like, I don't care.
Yeah, no, I absolutely hear you on that, and indeed you're right.
I mean, I was like traveling a lot as a performance artist, going to a lot of like smaller places around Europe with like different level of information, and meeting sometimes like a younger person there with like very little information, and I don't just want to like be that person who's like, well, I know that I can't cause you harm, so therefore it's not my responsibility. I think as much as it can then be like a mood killing or vibe killing moment, and that's then what like for a long time kept me within like certain circles.
I think you sound like you've got a sensible head on your shoulders, and you'd make a far better politician than me. Something that really struck me and annoys me about our own queer community is when I went on PrEP, the number of people on apps who would try to sex shame me for being on PrEP. and I just found, and I have to say, it was mostly young people. It was mostly guys in their 20s. The ignorance in the community just riled me.
I, to a certain extent, also have like, a certain understanding for that, like the fear of this is something that is like so deeply engraved in us that our fear of it doesn't just go away through information. We need to like, my fear went away because I saw friends and people around me living like with this and not getting sick and being like, unbothered by it. PrEP is an interesting topic. There's two big camps of like people who who have opinions in one end about it, and people have opinions at the other end about it. Like whether PrEP is just like, the miracle we've all been waiting for, or whether, or the people who like shame it and for all sorts of like reasons. And the problem is when it gets this like, two camps across from each other, then it gets really difficult to have a conversation about like, what does PrEP do for other STIs? Because once you start questioning things like that, then people be like, no, you're shaming the most important thing that like happened to us. Or like, I also think it's, what about people who for different reasons want to use condom? It's all like PrEP has made it like practically, unlike the time when I came to Berlin where most people were fucking bareback, but you still could ask for a condom and it would still be okay. If you want to use a condom now, when you go out to a dark room or a club or whatever, it's pretty much impossible to find somebody who will comply to that. I had this like experience, like I think it's for me quite a telling experience. I think it was like around 2013 or 14. Like I was having sex with a friend at the time. We didn't usually have sex. We hooked up a couple of times, and then like this one time we had sex, and he was fucking me, and suddenly he pulls out and is like all frightened because the condom broke. And the first thing he asks me about my status, and I tell him that I'm positive and undetectable. And the first thing he then says is like, he knows that is the best thing he could say, that this is the safest possible thing I could possibly tell him. And still, in spite of that, he is in like, his body is just like in panic. Even if he intellectually knows, rationally, that there's absolutely no risk. Also, he was topping me and no ejaculation, whatever, pulled out right away when the condom broke. But the fear of this thing was just like so embodied in him, and so like that knowledge doesn't just take us out of it. We need like to live.
How do you think though that we can change that? Because certainly from my, and I can only speak about from my perspective, but as I'm on PrEP, whether I'm topping or bottoming, the HIV status of my lover is irrelevant to me. Like, it's honestly irrelevant. It is of zero interest. There's zero panic about anything, whether he comes in me, whether I come in him. It's just a zero conversation. How do you think we might be able to get people to that stage where they are also thinking that? And respect to your friend for asking you and trying to process it. but how do we help other people who are not living with HIV to get to that same position that I'm in, where it's just a non-conversation?
I mean, PrEP, of course, has made the big difference that you can, if you're negative, you can protect yourself. Like, you cannot be sure that if somebody else is telling you that they're positive and undetectable, that is true. It probably is. Most people would be honest about this, but, people lie about all sorts of things to get somebody else into bed. So it's an unfair demand to say that somebody has to trust somebody when they tell you that they are positive and undetectable.
We're moving on now into the final portion of the episode. And this is where I like to say to the guests, the audience listening, and myself are going to pause for a moment for someone that you would like us to remember. Can you tell us who it is and why you'd like us to pause this moment?
I may be cheating a little bit because it's somebody who did not die of AIDS related causes. But the French writer Guillaume Destin, who was openly HIV positive, but died of an overdose in 2005 at the age of 39, but who wrote a lot about transgressive sex, drug use, chemsex at a time before it was the phenomenon that is today. His book called Nikolaj Tange, that was published for the first time. It was from the late 90s, but it was published for the first time in English translation by Semiotext last year, or was it the year before? It's one of my greatest reading experiences in the last years. He is in this really mode of radical oversharing, you can say. He sets out to write every single little detail of both his writing tour and going out to a club and getting laid, and then suddenly he goes, and then I applied for a job at a magazine. I sent them 40 pages of articles. They didn't want any of them, but here are the articles. And then he gives us 40 pages of these articles that are brilliant analysis of queer culture at the time, about house music and Gregoraki films and so on. And I just felt this that it was this immense gift of connection to somebody who was maybe living a life that was maybe close to mine today, but doing it at the time, or maybe close to mine 5 or 10 years ago, but doing it at a time when I was 16 and on my way to my first gay pride.
Now, Nikolaj, at the start of this episode, I said that you had spent nearly 2 decades navigating the gap between what the world thinks HIV means and what it actually means to live with it. What is that gap?
Oof. It's hard to say because I often where else do I see it? Sometimes when you watch Drag Race, there will be this episode where one of the contestants will be coming out as HIV positive. And it will always be this dramatic moment where the pink lighting goes down and the strings come on, and then they all hug and share some cry, and then they hug and say, this is so important that we talk about this and keep having this conversation and break the taboo. And I'm always there going cringe, because on one hand I'm yes, it's important that we talk about this, but on the other hand I'm also a taboo is not something we don't talk about. A taboo is something we keep reproducing as a taboo by talking about it as a taboo. So this thing of having it be this cry moment where we confirm that yes, it's so important to keep talking about it, also keeps reproducing it as a taboo, instead of just as I often try to and want to do, is mentioning it as something casual. If you want it to be seen as something that is not a big deal, you also have to find a way to talk about it as if it's not a big deal.
So, and this is a genuine question. This isn't a trap question. This is a genuine question.
Yeah, okay.
How do you think I can make sure that this podcast doesn't fall into that trap of almost fetishizing the drama and the taboo of living with HIV?
That's a good question. The thing is here, we're two gay men talking pretty openly and taking our time and having nuance and so on. It's we're not talking in front of an MTV production team or whoever RuPaul is streaming for at the moment. It's often like, when you talk to mainstream media or like straight media, I'm just sitting here doing like quotation marks. It's there that you have to like more like comply to the mainstream narratives. I also remember like when Mickey Blanco came out as HIV positive, I was also like, oh, why does it always have to be this like dramatic narrative around it? Like it was also like, well, it's because you're talking to straight music magazine or whatever it was. Like, can't we just
yeah. So brave. That's always isn't it? So brave.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to get real, or like where it's like, well, yeah.
So then, and I suspect I know what this answer might be, Nikolaj, if you were to send, as your final question in this episode, if you were to send a postcard to the world, what would you write on it?
Okay, I would maybe say, when I look out at the queer community, and I'm using here the term queer in the most inclusive sense possible, I see a lot of pain and trauma, and I also see a lot of joy and pleasure. And I do think that those two are connected, the pain and the pleasure. So I hope that we can move forward, allowing space for the pain, honor it for how it has shaped us into the skilled and resilient beings we are. And I also hope that we'll keep pushing together for more joy and for more pleasure. The Queer Manifesto says, every time we fuck, we win. And though I still believe that, I also still believe that there's a great resistance to be found in joy.
So then, Nikolaj, before we sign off, I'm very aware that you're a published author. So would you like to take this opportunity to promote yourself a little bit? Where can we get your works? What should we be looking out for?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm primarily writing in Danish, so a lot of that will not be accessible to most of your listeners. I mean, you can follow my Substack for random little quirks. It's Nikolajism with Nikolaj with a J and then ism. Or you can like find my novel, my previous, not the last one, but the one before, called Romeo and Seahorse. I translated to English, and that is out with the Cipher Press, the wonderful, amazing Cipher Press in the UK. Romeo and Seahorse is also slightly about HIV, but it's more a novel, I would say, about like experiences of toxic romanticism and chemsex during COVID, or as I like to put it, why Romeo and Juliet has more to say about chemsex than it does about love.
Lovely. It's not a book for people to buy their grandmother for Christmas.
It's like when people say not safe for work. It's like always depends on what your work is like, really.
Nikolaj Tange Lange, thank you so much for coming on HIV The Morning After. It's been really, really great talking to you and hearing your ideas and your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
If you were moved or informed by what you heard today, please help spread the word. Subscribe to HIV The Morning After and leave a rating and a review. It makes a huge difference in helping others to find it. Your support helps to amplify these experiences. If you'd like to get in touch, suggest a guest, or share your own thoughts, you can email me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. And remember, if you encounter HIV stigma in a bar, call it out. If you encounter it at work, call it out. If you encounter it online, call it out. Because if you don't, you're part of the problem. The theme tune is by Pauline Nidu at unstoppablemonsters.com. And many thanks to Murray Lang for his continued support. And thank you for listening. Join me next time for another important conversation on HIV The Morning After. I've been Dan Hall.